Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another video of the History by podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor Mark Goodacre, and today's topic centers around his book titled Thomas and the Gospels, a case for Thomas's familiarity with the synoptics, and I'll have a link to purchase this book in the description below. And before I get started with the questions, do you want to tell the audience about your YouTube channel?
Yeah, sure. I have had a podcast going for about 14 years now, since 2009. It's called NT Pod, like NT for New Testament Pod, the
Hmm.
podcast. And recently I've started uploading the back catalogue to YouTube, so you can tune into it there. And I'm hoping to release some video content there quite soon as well. So you can find me by looking for NT Pod or Mark Goodacre on YouTube, or if it's easier, just type in @Podacre onto YouTube and that'll get to me.
I'll have the links. I'll have the link to your YouTube channel into the NT
Awesome.
pod in the description.
Awesome.
So ever since Thomas was discovered, there have been scholars on different sides of the fence, um, ranging from talking about when does it date to does it know the synoptics? Is it independent of the synoptics? Does it support the existence of Q? And when you look at questions such as those, what led you to the conclusion that Thomas is most likely familiar with the synoptics?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the reason I started looking at Thomas in the first place was because when I was writing about Q, people kept saying to me, what about Thomas? Doesn't Thomas prove the existence of Q? So I had to get some kind of opinion on Thomas. And then, of course, once I started researching it, I found I was really interested in it, and it became a research interest in its own right. But those questions will never fully go away because of all of the non-canonical Gospels. Gospel of Thomas has got one of the best claims to antiquity. It really has to be not much later than the middle of the second century at the latest. And equally, it has so many interesting parallels with the Synoptic Gospels. At least half the content of Thomas is paralleled in the Synoptics. So it's always going to be posing those questions. Does it come after the Synoptics, or is it independent of them and come before them? Or is there some kind of combination of those different views? Some people go for a combination view.
And does Thomas appear to conflate material that he sees in the synoptics and double tradition material that he sees in Matthew and Luke?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, my case is that Thomas does know and use all three synoptic gospels. And one of the first reasons that I think that does become plausible is because you do see material that appears in all three, sometimes in a kind of mixed way. So it's not always like pure Matthew, pure Mark, pure Luke. Sometimes you get kind of mixtures of these things. And one of the things that is pretty easy to spot as soon as you open up a synopsis of the Gospels and start looking at Thomas's parallels with the synoptics. You notice that Thomas has got parallels to every single strand of Gospel material. So, in other words, it's not just the double tradition, the so-called Q material. Thomas has loads of parallels with the triple tradition, stuff that's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's also got parallels with stuff that's just in Mark and Matthew. It's got parallels with things that are kind of blurring these categories. And it also has parallels to material that's only in Matthew, material that's only in Mark, and material that's only in Luke. So it's kind of has this array of parallels going on. And that itself, I think, is quite telling.
And why did some think that Thomas might have been independent of the synoptics?
It's it's partly a question of form. So when you read Gospel of Thomas, a lot of its sayings are pithy. They're quite short. Someone will come to Jesus and Jesus will respond. Jesus says, and then you just get a short one sentence answer. And a lot of people said, well, given that you've got these pithy, terse sayings, they're the kind of things you could imagine being carried in oral tradition for a while. In other words, Thomas looked like what people imagined the oral tradition looked like. And they found it easier to say that those shorter, more pithy forms that you have in Thomas are earlier than the longer, apparently more developed forms that you get in the Synoptic Gospels. And you can see it in particular with things like Thomas's parables. So if you take the parable of the sower, for example, In the Synoptic Gospels, that's in all three synoptics. And the version in all three synoptics takes a lot more words to say than the version in Thomas. And equally, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have an interpretation added to the sower. The sower sows the word, so the sower is Jesus, the seed is the word, the different kinds of ground are different kinds of people. And so what happens is that people looked at that and they said, well, maybe the Thomas version, which doesn't have the interpretation, is much shorter, is more original than the synoptic one. So in terms of the direction of travel, it looked to a lot of people like it was more likely that you have the terse, shorter, pithy gospel stories, gospel narratives evolving into something that was longer, of the kind that you get in the synoptics. So that's probably one of the key pieces of the independence argument.
And what do you think about that methodology that the shorter version usually suggests the earlier? Does that seem to make sense, or does that assumption have problems?
Yeah, I think that's the thing. The assumption does have problems. So you can actually see when you look at other ancient texts that it's not a universal rule that the earlier, more primitive version is always shorter. Sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not. And you can see that in the Synoptic Gospels themselves, that sometimes when Luke is using Mark and when Matthew's using Mark, and I would say also when Luke's using Matthew, sometimes they condense material and sometimes they expand it and sometimes they keep it the same. So in other words, shortness and pithiness is not necessarily a sign of primitivity. It's also not necessarily a sign of being secondary either, but it's just that is an indicator of ancient, original, or kind of oral Jesus. That's the bit that's kind of problematic. And of course, the people that argue for Thomasine independence do have many more weapons in their armory than just that. But that one, I think, has been one of the most influential, because people, when they try and imagine oral tradition, they do imagine it'd be easier to remember sayings of Jesus if they were shorter.
What do you make of some of the unique sayings of Jesus and Thomas not found in the four Gospels?
It's a great question, because some of them really are quite entertaining. I mean, one of my favorites is saying 7, which is basically, blessed is the man who, actually, let me make sure that I don't misquote this, because it's so strange that I could easily misquote it. Jesus says, blessed is the lion which becomes a man when consumed by a man, and cursed is the man whom the lion consumes, and the lion becomes man. I think that's just a fascinating saying, and it's really difficult to know what the author means by it. And lots of stuff in Thomas is like that. There's a whole bunch of quite fascinating pieces. And there are some pieces, to be fair, that sound very much like the Synoptic Gospels Jesus, but aren't Synoptic Jesus. So you do get, as well as those actual parallels, like parable of the sower and so on, you get some things like there's a parable about a woman who takes home a whole jar of meal, but the jar basically gets cracked and all the meal pours out as she's walking home. So that sounds like the kind of thing that you see in the Synoptic Gospels, even though it's not there. So there's a mixture amongst the new sayings. Some are very, I mean, I'm a bit nervous about saying bizarre, because I don't want to get into the kind of canonical bias of suggesting that Thomas is bizarre and the Synoptic Gospels are not bizarre. I mean, there's loads of bizarre stuff in the Synoptic Gospels as well. But yes, some of them are really quite striking to us, and some of them are just pretty mundane and pretty ordinary. There's a real range of stuff in the Gospel of Thomas.
And do you think that the author of Thomas, whoever that person was, created that material, or did this person get that material from somewhere else besides the four Gospels?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's very difficult when you're dealing with unique material, because then you're only guessing. And my sense is that it's probably both. I think that sometimes the author is creating fresh material, and sometimes he's delving into other sayings that we just don't know about. I mean, there's a new papyrus fragment that was published just a few weeks ago, which has an interesting parallel to Thomas in it. from Gospel of Thomas 27, which talks about those who fast towards the world and how they will inherit the kingdom, and those who sabotage the Sabbath or keep a Sabbath as a Sabbath, they will see the Father. Now, that saying previously we only really knew from the Gospel of Thomas, and it popped up in this new papyrus that's just been published. And that raises the really interesting question of, could there be other early Christian Gospels that Thomas is drawing on as well as the Synoptic Gospels? So I would be entirely open to some of those new materials that we see in Thomas having emerged from, from other texts that we just don't know about. I think it'd be foolish to rule that out, to be honest.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that new papyrus fragment. And I know that Q was also brought up when that text was found.
Yeah.
And yeah, what do you think about that in conjunction with Q? Like some even wonder if that's actually if it was actually familiar with the Gospels or not. What do you make of all that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an absolutely fascinating fragment. It's only really small. It's like 9 centimeters by 3 centimeters, so it's pretty small. So we've only got a little tiny bit of whatever it comes from, but it's certainly not a fragment of something that we've ever seen before. In other words, there's no known gospel that has, or other saying that has those particular sayings in the particular order that you have. And for those who haven't had a chance to look at it yet, which is probably lots of people, it quotes from, or it has material parallel to Matthew 6 and Luke 12. It's the material about consider the birds of the air, how they don't reap, and consider the lilies of the field, how they don't work or spin. So that's the predominant material there. But there's also this saying 27, which is the one I was just quoting about fasting from the world and sabotaging the Sabbath. Those, so what happens is that bit is kind of in the new fragment is inserted in between the bits about consider the birds and consider the lilies. So that's kind of fascinating. And the fragment itself, the new fragment, is dated by its editors to the middle of the 2nd century, which is really, really early. I mean, that's really fantastic stuff for ancient papyrus fragments. And so it raises the question, does the author of the work that it's from, does that work know the Synoptic Gospels? Does it know Matthew and Luke? Does it know Thomas? Or could it be a source for them? Now, my working hypothesis is that the new work, this fragment, does seem to show some knowledge of Luke in particular, because the order that it puts the sayings in has a unique parallel in Luke. So you start off with the parable of the rich fool, or what looks like the rich fool, which is Gospel of Thomas 63, but it's in Luke 12, 16 to 21. And that bit in Luke comes just before the birds and the lilies bit. So that would make it pretty interesting in terms of, does this fragment's author know Luke's gospel because it's that Lucan order? But it can't just know Luke, because you can't just get that stuff from Luke, because the wording of a lot of it is wording that is unique to Matthew. So we can definitely see the word Heavenly Father in there, and that is unique to Matthew in that passage. So the best bet, my best bet, and it's always really, really tentative on these things because it's so small, but my best bet is that the author of this piece knows Matthew and Luke, both Matthew and Luke, and it may also know the Gospel of Thomas. The intriguing opposite possibility is that the author of this passage doesn't know the Gospel of Thomas because Thomas hasn't been written yet. It just could be the Gospel of Thomas was written later than this work. And that would be really, really interesting, because that then would mean that this is a fragment of a really early gospel. I mean, it's early whatever, but it could be really early. So it's really striking piece. Oh, I didn't answer your question about Q though, did I? Shall I go ahead to that now?
Yeah.
So one of the reasons why it excited quite a lot of interest is that if you have a new fragment turning up and it's sayings of Jesus, and sayings of Jesus that are paralleled in both Matthew and Luke, as well as Thomas, that does sound a little bit like what people postulate Q to be. So when this fragment was first announced, lots of people were getting in touch with me and saying, Mark, I think they might have found Q, and people love to tease me about that because I have nailed my colors to the mast on that one and said I don't think Q existed. So that was always a little bit inconvenient that people were saying that. But once I got to look at it, I realized it couldn't be Q. I mean, I don't think Q existed, so I didn't expect it to be Q anyway. But anyway, the reason why it can't be Q, in my opinion, is that Matthew and Luke in those places, they've got loads and loads of agreement together against this fragment, which means that this fragment wouldn't solve anything. In other words, Matthew and Luke would still have to be using something else as well as this fragment if they're independent of one another. So in other words, you'd still need another Q. And if you need another Q after this fragment, then you haven't really solved the problem at all. You've just sort of sidelined it. And if you just back to the beginning again with trying to postulate another Q, then I think you've got a problem. But Martijn Linssen has a really nice phrase. He says it's not Q, but it is a quelle. In other words, it's not Q, but it is a source. It might well be a source for other early Christian works. And like I say, that could be really interesting. I'm not 100% convinced of that yet, but it's a really interesting possibility. And I think it is important to keep these possibilities open.
So if Thomas does date after this fragment, is it possible that Thomas used this text as a source?
Yeah, I think it really is, because one of the things that you see in the way that Thomas uses the Synoptic Gospels is it fairly rarely uses the same order that you have in Matthew or Luke or Mark. It's almost like you could pick out a whole bunch of synoptic sayings and jumble them around, and you would see about the same amount of parallels in order that you see when you look at Thomas against the synoptic. So they don't follow. So one of the reasons we know that there's a literary link between Matthew and Mark, say, is that B follows A, C follows B, D follows. I mean, like, the order is just so often the same. Same in Luke, order is so often the same as it is in Mark. But when you get to this fragment, I've still got that on the mind. When you get to the Gospel of Thomas, you don't have that thing of a piece that you have in the synoptics following another piece, like in sequential parallel order. So this fragment could be a source for Thomas, because what Thomas would have done in that case is he would have seen that saying, which he's got in 27, and pulled it out of its context in this fragment and put it into its text there. And Thomas does do that kind of thing. It extracts things from Matthew and Luke and Mark and gives them a fresh, unique kind of context. So yeah, it could be. I kind of hope it is, because I mean, there's nothing more exciting than the discovery of a new Christian work. I mean, we don't know if it's a gospel because it's so small. It could be, an early church writer just quoting the Gospels. It could be a big sort of narrative gospel, and this just happens to be a bit of sayings in it. But yeah. I mean, it's the possibilities are absolutely wide open at the moment.
And how is the theology of Jesus portrayed in Thomas?
There are very clear points of contact with the Synoptic Gospels, but what are most noticeable are the points of divergence, and there are quite a lot of points of divergence in Thomas. So, for one thing, you don't see in Thomas the same stress on eschatology. You don't have this idea of the kingdom of God coming crashing in and being this dramatic change. You don't see the Son of Man returning, coming again. That all of that kind of language has gone. And instead, what we have in Thomas is a Jesus who's like a kind of wise sage. He's the ultimate talking head that just pronounces wisdom about things. And that is sort of that is the overwhelming sense that you get, that you have to listen to Jesus to get salvation. There's a sense in the Synoptic Gospels that you attain your salvation by, in some way or other, following Jesus and by adhering yourself to Jesus. In the Gospel of Thomas, it's all about listening to his words and finding the correct interpretation of them. So right at the very beginning of Thomas, you have the line that the one that finds the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death. Now, that phrase tasting death does come in the synoptics in Mark 9:1, but there it's, some of you will not have tasted death before you see the kingdom of God come with power. So in one text, you don't taste death before you've seen the kingdom crashing in, coming in power. In the other text, you don't taste death just when you listen to Jesus's sayings. So you can see that there's some contact there, but there's also quite important divergence. And I would say, in addition to that, Jesus is never called the Christ in the Gospel of Thomas. He's never called the Lord. He is referred to as Son of Man on one occasion, but he's not Son of God. So they're pretty striking things. I mean, the four canonical Gospels of the New Testament are insistent that Jesus is the Christ, that Jesus is the Son of God, that Jesus is Lord. It talks about him as a prophet. And you don't really have those kind of things in the Gospel of Thomas. So it's a really different picture of Jesus. Still recognizably Jesus, but it's a different picture of Jesus than you get in the Synoptics.
What do you think the Synoptics is doing by omitting all those titles? Is it trying to make out Jesus to be less than those pangs, trying to make him out to be a prophet of some kind or something else?
I think you mean how does Thomas sort of why does Thomas leave those things out?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a good question. I think a part of it is that the Gospel of Thomas seems uninterested in what you might call Israel's story, which I think all the Synoptic Gospels and John are. In other words, the Synoptic Gospels and John try to put Jesus in narrative continuity with the Old Testament or with the Hebrew Bible. So you have Moses is somebody who is relevant to Jesus' story. David is relevant because Jesus is the son of David. And then you have all of these prophets like Isaiah, who, for the Synoptic writers and for John, they prophesy Jesus. So Jesus is part of that story of Israel. And terms like Son of God and Messiah are relevant to that particular story. Now, Thomas doesn't really want to put Jesus in that narrative continuity with Israel. In fact, there's one occasion in Thomas where people come up to him, the disciples come up to him, and they say, 24 prophets prophesied over you. And Jesus says, why are you talking to me about dead people when the living one is in your midst? I think that's 52, if I remember rightly. I should make sure that I don't give out false information. But yes, that's 52. And what's fascinating about that is the very thing that Jesus does in the Synoptic Gospels and in John all the time is he's said to fulfill the scriptures. He's said to fulfill what the prophets have prophesied. But Thomas doesn't seem to think that. He wants to say, look, we're not going to talk about these prophets. They're dead people. We're going to talk about the living one. And that term, the living one, is Thomas's favorite term for Jesus. It's right there at the beginning of the gospel. It says that, he is the living one. So it gets rid of titles like Son of God and Christ and brings in instead this term, the living one. And I think the best reason for that is that Thomas really doesn't see Jesus, like the Synoptics do, as being the culmination of Israel's redemptive story. I think that's what's going on.
What is the missing middle in Thomas?
That's something that I came up with. One of the phenomena that it seemed to me nobody had noticed is that. Okay, well, let me take a step back. When I was writing my book on the Gospel of Thomas, one of the things that people hadn't done very much is put the synoptics alongside Thomas in a synopsis. And I like to see things visually. I think I'm quite a visual person. So, which is a bit strange for someone that has an audio podcast. But anyway, quite a visual person. I like to be able to see things side by side. And when I started lining up Thomas on the one side with the synoptics on the other side, I kept seeing that there would be a bit of parallel here at the beginning in Thomas, and then a parallel at the end. But then in the middle, things were missing. There was no parallel content. to the point where sometimes in the Gospel of Thomas, it was even difficult to follow the story because a key point would be missing. So an example is there's a story in all three synoptics about how Jesus is asked if you should pay your taxes to Caesar or not. And the answer that Jesus gives, he says, well, look, show me a coin. Have you got a coin? And then they get a coin, and he says, okay, whose inscription's on it? And they say, Caesar's. So Jesus then says, well, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and render unto God the things that are God. Very famous saying. Now, when you get to Thomas's parallel to that in Thomas 100, you have the beginning bit of the story where Jesus says, show me a coin, and you have the end of the story about rendering to Caesar, but the middle bit of the story is missing. And my thesis is, and it's just a thesis, because this keeps happening in Thomas over and over again. My thesis is that the writer is a bit like one of those people, and I would include myself in this, is not very good at telling jokes. And so you start telling the joke, but you don't manage to tell all of the relevant information because you're so desperate to jump ahead to the punchline. And then the joke doesn't work sometimes because the punchline requires all of the information that you've had. So I think that's what's going on. I think he quotes, but then he races ahead to the end. And it's part of his attempt to abbreviate stuff, to make things more terse, like we were talking about before. But if you make things more terse by taking material out of the middle of something, it makes it more that piece on the render unto Caesar. Thomas has a great variant. Instead of just render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God, it adds and give to me what is mine. So it has a third bit to it. So that's kind of interesting as well, and suggests some differentiation between Jesus and God. But yeah, that's kind of what the missing middle is. And I argue that it's a phenomenon that you can see in other early Christian writers when they're quoting material, that they'll sometimes quote the beginning and the end of a passage or a saying and miss out the middle bit. But it's a hypothesis. I can't prove that that's what's going on. I mean, I can show that I can show that the middle is often missing. It's my guess as to why it's happening, that it's an accident that is happening in Thomas's desire to abbreviate and to get to the point as quickly as possible.
So what do you think the point of this gospel is? Why do you think it was written? Why do you think the author has gone through such this overall, he's gone through such trouble to abbreviate, remove titles, make Jesus less than what the gospels portray him to be? What is the ultimate point to all that?
It's a great question. I mean, I think a large part of it is that I would imagine, you have to just hypothesize about what the author was doing, but I would imagine that the author wouldn't see his work as taking away from the synoptics so much as giving a completely different spin on Jesus. So the writer is just much less interested in things like the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus. He's more interested in depicting Jesus as a sage who has wise things to say in the present. That's why he's the living Jesus. Doesn't want to talk about the crucifixion, doesn't want to talk about the resurrection, wants to talk about Jesus as somebody who's relevant to the now. And I think that's a large part of what's going on. But I also wonder whether the key is the whole question of finding the interpretation of these sayings. So the gospel is, in a way, aiming to be enigmatic. It's not trying to be crystal clear and deliver it to you easily. It wants to be mysterious. It thinks it is mysterious, and it is mysterious. It wants to promise you that there are further layers if you keep reflecting on these sayings. So I think the gospel wants you to read it all the way through, or to listen to it all the way through, and then go back to the beginning again and do it again, and then do it again, and to keep doing it, and then find connections between the different sayings and find some way. It's a bit like walking through a maze. It wants you to keep trying different routes through and to get to a better knowledge of who Jesus is by taking you on this kind of mysterious and enigmatic kind of route. So I think that's partly what it's doing. And that might also mean that for its original users, they read this in a community. It wasn't something that they were necessarily sitting down and meditating on their own. They were in a community and they would say to the guru, hey, what does saying 7 mean? And then he'll say, well, what do you think it means? And someone says, well, I think it means this. And then someone goes, well, I think it means this. And then they kind of come to an interpretation of the sayings together. So that's part of their making of salvation, is their discussing of how these things work. So I guess, and again, it's a complete guess, but that would be my guess, that it presupposes, Thomas does, a community that does some interpretation together. And it's I mean, whether this was done over the dinner table, whether it was done in some kind of church setting, or of course, dinner time and church were frequently the same thing in antiquity. So it may be that they're doing that. But given that it talks so much about fasting and abstinence from the world, I kind of like to imagine it's more a group of ascetics. I like to imagine like kind of sitting, under a tree somewhere, mulling over these things in a kind of esoteric way and kind of reaching enlightenment together. I think that's kind of what the text evokes. It keeps drawing you and asking you to ask more questions all the time.
What makes it clear, or apparently clear, that Thomas is familiar specifically with the Gospel of John?
Well, do you know what? It's the hardest one is the Gospel of John, because Thomas doesn't have any direct, really close parallels with John. So it doesn't seem to quote John much at all. As perhaps the most obvious links between Thomas and John are the issue of Jesus as light. So John's gospel does have this Jesus is the light of the world, and the Gospel of Thomas also sees Jesus as coming from the light. So that, I would say, is one of the closest conceptual similarities. But I've grappled with this quite a bit. I mean, did the gospel, I'm so sure that Thomas knew the synoptics, but it's really hard to make the case that the gospel knew John. And it may be that the gospel is kind of familiar with John, but chooses not to use it. I mean, if I were the author of the Gospel of Thomas, I would have quite liked sayings like, I am the light of the world. And, I could see the author pulling some of that stuff in there. But I think a lot of the rest of the terminology in John, the Gospel of Thomas certainly wouldn't like the idea of resurrection and life, because resurrection is not something that's a big theme in Thomas. And I can't see the author of Thomas using lots of the other bits and pieces that you get in John. So it's a difficult one. I mean, there's a really fun theory that is associated with Elaine Pagels and with another writer whose name is just suddenly escaping me, which is that perhaps you reverse it and say the Gospel of John knew Thomas. And that would be quite interesting, because the Gospel of John does have a character, Thomas, in it, famously Doubting Thomas. And that character of Doubting Thomas is not only apparently interested in the crucifixion, like he talks about being on the way with Jesus, but also that Thomas figure, he makes his confession, my Lord and my God, after having seen the resurrected Jesus with his wounds. And you could hardly want for something that's less like the Gospel of Thomas than that, because Gospel of Thomas, no crucifixion, no resurrection. Jesus is never described as Lord. Jesus is never described as God. But here in the Gospel of John, Thomas sees the resurrected Jesus, sees the wounds that connect him with the crucifixion, and then he makes a confession of Lord and God. So Thomas and John are right at the opposite ends of the spectrum. So some people think that John, I mean, Elaine Pagels is the one that I mentioned. They think that John is like polemicizing against the Gospel of Thomas here. And that would just be a really fascinating thing if true. Unfortunately, I think it's probably not true, because I can't get the datings to work. I mean, if Thomas is already around by the middle of the 2nd century, and if it dates from the middle of the 2nd century, you'd actually have to make John later than that. And that just pushes John so close to our first papyrus fragments of John, as well as writers talking about John. I mean, Irenaeus is already talking about John as one of the four gospels that, is like the four corners of the world at the end of the 2nd century. So the idea that John is only recently emerged would be really, really hard. So I think that the idea that Thomas is a source for John isn't gonna work, unfortunately, because I think it's a very attractive thesis, that is. So that's the hardest one to do. I think the Thomas John parallels, that's the hardest. I personally find the synoptic Thomas parallels much easier to tease out, because so often when you're looking at the Gospel of Thomas uses Matthew's distinctive way of saying things, and sometimes Thomas will use Luke's distinctive way of saying things, and that's one of the things that persuades me that Thomas knows the synoptics. I talk about like his redactional fingerprints. Like Luke's got his very distinctive way of talking, and so is Matthew. And then when it turns up in Thomas, you think, well, that sounds like this author knows those books and not the sources of those books.
Is it possible that Thomas knew potentially a primitive gospel that is lost that inspired him to create a more primitive, abbreviated story of Jesus, to remove titles and to remove gospel descriptions of Jesus?
It's entirely possible. And one thing that Francis Watson has argued is that even though he thinks the Gospel of Thomas is dependent on the synoptics, he thinks that it still illustrates a genre of literature which might well predate the synoptics. In other words, there could well have been sayings gospels that have got lost. I mean, maybe this P-Oxy 5575 is an example of it, but yeah, there may well have been. I mean, I suppose my take on these things is that I'm not skeptical at all about the existence of other gospels, and the idea that people put together sayings gospels seems to me entirely possible. I'm just hesitant or reluctant to try and dig those out as if we're doing archaeology from the text of the gospels. So I mean, I suppose my skepticism isn't about the existence of sayings gospels or other gospels. It's about our ability as scholars to tease them out. I think that's the thing. I sometimes think that textual scholars are basically frustrated archaeologists. We spend so long staring at text that we're kind of envious of our archaeological colleagues that go and get their hands dirty and discover new things. And so we like try and do archaeology in the text. And I think that's one of the problems, because it's really, really hard to do archaeology in a text. It's really hard to do it. Texts aren't like that. I mean, yes, they are sometimes built up in layers, but our ability to uncover those layers is often pretty limited. So yeah, it's a very long-winded answer to your question, but yeah, I do think it's entirely possible that there were gospels around, sayings gospels around, and that it might have provided a model for something like Thomas. Yeah, I wouldn't rule that out. I mean, just to be clear, I would love it if that was the case. I mean, I as much as anybody else, would love it for more ancient Christian but a non-Christian text to emerge. I think that's what we all hope for all the time.
And why do you date the Gospel of Thomas to the middle of the 2nd century CE? What informs you that it was written around that time?
It's partly a result just of relative dating. So in the sense that, because I argue that Thomas knows Matthew, Mark, and Luke, then obviously Thomas postdates the latest of those. And for me, that's Luke's gospel. And I think that Luke's gospel is probably no earlier than the end of the 2nd century, and it might be as late as the early 2nd century. So part of it is that Thomas has to postdate its most recent source, which is Luke. And one of the reasons I think Luke is as late as that is that I'm pretty convinced by Steve Mason's arguments that Luke knows Josephus, and Josephus's Antiquities. I mean, he specifically knows Antiquities, I think. And Josephus's Antiquities is written in the 90s of the 1st century. So Luke probably has to postdate that. So part of it is a relative case, but it's also that there's a saying in basically, well, there's two back-to-back sayings in Gospel of Thomas 70 and 71. And they seem to allude not just to the destruction of the temple, but also to the Bar Kokhba War. And the Bar Kokhba War is generally dated around 135. And the reason why Bar Kokhba is so striking is it's basically the second big revolt after the revolt of 70, when the 66 to 70, when the temple is destroyed. But with Bar Kokhba, basically Jerusalem is effectively evacuated, in the sense that they can no longer even sacrifice on the ruins of the Temple Mount. And it looks like that traumatic event has made its impact on Thomas. Now, I mean, that's not my argument, but it's an argument that's made by other scholars that I find convincing. So I do have a chapter in the book on that, on the dating of the Gospel of Thomas, and that's where I think it makes best sense. So we push it post Bar Kokhba, post Luke's Gospel. It means that the best time for it to be written is the 140s or so, something like that. And that feels about right, because there are other texts around in the later 2nd century that Thomas, does resemble a bit, but it looks like a kind of early. I don't know. Part of it sounds terribly unscientific when I say it feels right there, but sometimes you do have to go on scholarly instincts as well. And to me, Thomas feels right in the early to mid 2nd century, but really probably more mid 2nd century than beyond. And on the other end of things, we can't date it beyond the end of the 2nd century, because the earliest papyrus fragments of Thomas do date to the early 3rd century. So when our first glimpse that we got of the Gospel of Thomas back in, I mean, we weren't alive then, but in 1897 and 1903, Grenfell and Hunt discovered what turned out to be 3 pieces, papyrus fragments of the Gospel of Thomas. And they're 3 parts of 3 different works. One's written on a scroll, one's written on a codex, and one's written on the back of a land plan. And those are dated variously from the early to middle 3rd century. So Thomas obviously has to be earlier than that. So that's really the range. I think Thomas really has to be written somewhere between 140 and 200, something like that. And I'm happier in the earlier period than the later, because otherwise it pushes up too close against those papyrus fragments of Thomas.
And in my closing question, why do you think that this gospel was attributed to Thomas?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, because the character it seems to be attributing it to is it calls Didymus Judas Thomas, and in most manuscripts of the Synoptic Gospels and John, he's just called Thomas. That there are some manuscripts of John where he is called Judas Thomas, but most of the time he's just called Thomas. But here, Didymus Judas Thomas is fascinating, because Didymus is essentially the Greek word for twin, and Thomas is the Aramaic word for twin. So the author of this gospel really wanted to emphasize that word twin. That's the thing that he's really interested in. And then you have to say, why does he want to insist that Jesus is the gospel of that? Sorry, why does the author want to insist that Thomas is the twin? And it's probably a theological, Christological reason, in that I think he believes that the ideal follower of Jesus is someone who becomes like Jesus. And there's no better person to describe how to do that than his own twin brother. And we know that there was speculation about Jesus's twin brother because you find it in other ancient texts, most clearly in the Acts of Thomas, in which Thomas does look just like Jesus. So he's not just a twin brother, but he's an identical twin. And I think that that's why he chooses Thomas for his hero. And I think also something you get quite a bit in non-canonical gospels that already know John and the Synoptics. They often want to draw out a lesser character from the gospel narrative. So if you just sort of say, oh, well, this gospel is written by Peter or this gospel is written by Matthew, then people will go, really, is it? It's much easier to say this gospel is written by this hitherto minor character. It makes it kind of more plausible that why you've suddenly come up with this different take on things. So, and it's obviously a fictional it's a fictional choice, you know, for it to be Thomas, but it's a choice that makes sense when you've read Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas, and its idea of basically becoming more like Jesus, being on pilgrimage to be more like Jesus. That's my best guess on why it's called that. And it is very, it does really want to push that, because it's not just a casual thing that comes along right at the end of the text and it says, oh, by the way, this is written by Thomas. It's right there front and center at the top of the manuscript. And then in Thomas 13, you get another reference to Thomas, and there's a conversation going on with Jesus. So yeah, I think that's my best guess as to what's going on there.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Mark Goodacre.
It's a pleasure. It's always great to have your company.
Likewise.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.